This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And welcome to the Institute of Philosophy. I'm Barry Smith, the director of the Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here for the launch of Julian Baggini's new book, The Virtues of the Table, How to Eat and Think. And we're going to be talking about it with a panel of interested and engaged thinkers about food, people who are practitioners, people who look at the food production and animal husbandry end of the whole process. And there are so many issues that Julian deals with in the book that we could have had any number and ranges of expertise to be here to present and to talk to us this evening. But we're absolutely delighted that we have Dr. Naomi Sykes, who's a zoo archaeologist from the Department of Archaeology in Nottingham. And Naomi is one of the key researchers on a very large AHRC grant that looks at human-animal interactions and indeed focusing specifically on our dealings with chicken, but has already conducted research, as she'll tell you, I think, into the study of deer. And we're very lucky also to have Ben Reade, who's the head of research at the Nordic Food Lab, who through that mighty organ has connections, of course, with the Noma restaurant in Copenhagen. And Ben is conducting some research with colleagues here at the Centre for the Study of the Senses, Ophelia Derrois and Charles Spence from Oxford. And I think the thing we will do to begin with is that Julian and I will just talk a little bit, and then we'll have some reflections and thoughts from our colleagues and panelists. So let me sit down so that we can begin the conversation, and I'll try to put this in the right place. So Julian, I greatly enjoyed reading the book. I was provoked, stimulated, but most of all I think I was all the time surprised and wrong-footed on some of the prejudices and assumptions that I thought were very well grounded and which I had been happy to go into bars, restaurants and pubs and argue for, seemingly authoritatively. And this really shook me out of my complacence. And I wonder whether when you were writing it, you started off in one direction, and through the writing and through the interviews, whether you yourself came to change your thinking radically.
That's a good question, actually. I think I certainly did sort of change my thinking. I'm not sure there's any particular issue I sort of didn't about turn on, because I think one of the things that most interested me about it and made me think it was worth writing was a sense that virtually all these issues were just more complicated than most people thought they were. And it was a kind of sense of awareness that things weren't so straightforward in the first place was what was trying to motivate me to sort of at least clarify the terrain a bit. And that is very deep-rooted, because interestingly enough, I mean, I've done perhaps a stupid thing of reading reviews of the book. And reviews are often very, very good at really making very acute criticisms of what you didn't say. But there was one review which, of all of them, was actually probably the most positive. It was really positive, loved the book, but it was really inaccurate. The thing was, what this guy had done, he had seen in the book the things which conformed to his viewpoint. And so he portrayed the book in particular as being sort of just blanketly kind of dismissive of all organics and everything, whereas actually I think there's a lot more nuance in that. My argument was that organics isn't the be-all and end-all, and there are certain things about organics which aren't very good, going back to your point about things being quite complicated. But it certainly wasn't kind of like saying, you're better off being a non-organic cow than an organic one, which is the way this person presented it. So I think for me, it's actually trying to make the complexity as clear as possible, which was one of the main motivations, rather than necessarily to present my view. I mean, my views are there, but I think the kind of work I do as a kind of someone writing about philosophy from not from an academic viewpoint, I think that's a lot of what I'm trying to do in general, really, which is to sort of try and, if you like, make the general discourse around an issue. Ask better questions for people, I think.
So there are lots of good questions, and there you're not shy of giving answers, I think,
Okay.
either, or stating opinions, which is I think a good thing for a philosopher. But I wondered whether you had an idea or a thought about why discussions of food are so prevalent and topical now. I mean, in some sense, this book is very timely, and you're launching into a discussion and I think a set of interests that are there. So why are we so concerned and preoccupied with food and lots of dimensions of food now?
Well, that is a very good question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. I think there are several factors I might be able to identify, but I'm not confident in saying which ones are the critical ones. I mean, one is actually just a straightforwardly kind of consumerist thing, actually, which is that we've gone through a period in which, basically cheap, widely available food became the norm. So in terms of quantity, people, most people can eat well. And now I know there are some people where food banks are a lot in the news, and there are people who can't, but for the majority of people, they're able to eat enough. And in terms of the choice available to people as well, you can get a huge range of things without going very far. Things that were like impossible to find 20 years ago in Britain, you can find in any old supermarket. And in a sense, that kind of develops this rather, you might say, quite shallow sort of one-upmanship kind of thing, one cookmanship, whatever you want to call it, where people are seeking out more and more interesting things. So part of the developing interest in food is actually that kind of consumerist arms race of people trying to sort of become more and more exclusive and discerning to prove their difference. That's a not so wholesome aspect of it. On the plus side, I think again there is just a general raising of the education. People have travelled more, they've learnt more about food, and actually there's a genuine sense in which people are more aware of the difference between good and bad food. Then, of course, there's a growing awareness of the ethical and environmental issues around food, which again have become remarkably mainstream, really. I mean, if you think about how animal welfare as an issue has developed, I mean, we've had vegetarians for quite a long time, but they've always generally been a bit kind of on the margins, considered a bit freakish. And when I sort of went sort of de facto vegetarian when I was about sort of 20, it was in a context whereby if you weren't very happy about the way in which most meat was reared, not eating it was pretty much the only choice. It's not like you could go and buy a free-range chicken. The term, you wouldn't even know what that term meant there. And we've gone from that to a position where actually you can get things like free-range and organic. It's very, very mainstream, and people take issues of welfare very seriously. Similarly, fair trade. The issue of people being aware of the fact that a lot of the stuff we get, which is coming from developing countries, is being produced by people who are not being paid enough to live, basically. So we're enjoying luxuries like coffee and chocolate, and the people producing them can't send their kids to school or afford basic medicines. Again, that is something which has gone from the fringes to a situation now whereby the top 4 selling chocolates in Britain all use fair trade chocolate. Dairy Milk and Kit Kat, and the other 2 I can't remember. They all use fair trade now. No one would have imagined that. 15 years ago, people would have said, "There's never in a million years will Nestle, who are big, demons of the food world, no way would they do fair trade." They do. Fair trade coffee. Any decent, all the major chains either have some form of certified fair trade or some big policy they can point to which says we ethically source. And so putting these things all together, there's just a whole set of things around awareness of both food quality, food provenance, health, and everything as well. And that's generated a lot of interest. But going back to your opening comments, really, I think that there are a lot of assumptions knocking around there. And a lot of what are actually quite decent rules of thumb that people are using, but they don't stand up to scrutiny. And you say, as a rule of thumb, it might work. So if you're in a hurry and you're in a supermarket and you want to eat something, you want to buy something which you think has been produced in a good way, and the only thing you can go on is one's labelled organic and one isn't, then sure, organic. But it is only a rule of thumb. And if you really are interested in buying well, I think you do need to look beyond those things and ask, what do they stand for? What do they mean? And what are the real pros and cons?
I think you do a great job at making us aware of the reach of fair trade, but also examining the motives why people might adopt fair trade. And as you say, I think in the book, there are some people who will still refuse to eat Nestle, even if their Kit Kats are based on fair trade principles, because they don't believe the motive behind choosing that. It might be a very successful marketing tool. So, I mean, I think there are ethical issues that you raise and which sort of remain for people even once you've pointed this out. But we have to start from having the right information. So I think the book does that. Let me, before we go for our heavy-hitting reflections from our two guests here, I want to ask you a question that's sort of personally close to my heart. So as a philosopher like you, who works on things that concern what are often called the lower or bodily senses, so working on perception of flavour or on philosophy in wine, people say, well, this has got to be something very trivial because, after all, you're talking about bodily pleasures, and that's just a modification of your own conscious state of awareness. So it's not telling you great issues about knowledge or something that leads you to wisdom. So the bit of you that joined forces, and I saw you as, comrade in arms in talking about issues to do with food and eating, but what do you say to the people who say this can't be of any philosophical value, it's just about the lower senses?
Oh, well, there's a lot to say about that. It also ties up with other things as well. Again, one thing I really noticed from the reaction is that, it might be a particularly British thing, that there's a real kind of reluctance to kind of be seen to take something as base and as food seriously. It's a bit kind of suspiciously French, isn't it, frankly? The French might dare to do that, but we are British, and let's be sensible about this. At the end of the day, it's nourishment, full stop. Yeah, no, I think that's really mistaken. That actually is one of the other real key motivators for writing the book. I do think there's quite a fundamental kind of mistake that is being made and continued when we think of philosophy and the higher arts as somehow the most superior things precisely because they don't involve our body. I mean, this is a historic view. I mean, Aristotle is the philosopher who one of the philosophers I most admire, and a lot of the book is written in the spirit of Aristotle. But where I think he was very, very wrong was, he was when he asked the question, how ought we to live? He thought the way to answer that is essentially you divide up live life according to its distinctive functions, and you have a hierarchy from the midi-vegetative to the animal to the human, and if the real essence, if you like, of a particular life form is what is distinctive to it. Now, what is distinctive to human beings, what we do not share with the animals, is basic things like appetite and so forth. It's intellect. That intellect is the thing which makes us different and special. But I think it just doesn't follow from that therefore the way to live an authentically human life is to concentrate as much as possible on that, to the detriment of those other things. The fact that we share them with other forms of life doesn't mean they're not essential parts of our essence. So if you're going to take the most basic philosophical question of them all, which is how ought we to live, I think the answer to that has got to involve our complete natures, which is, in various senses of the word, heart, mind, body, heart and soul. And I think therefore that thinking about the role food and these physical sensations plays in our life is very important to getting an authentically human life. And there is a balance, of course, because if you deny the intellect, then you do become like a beast. There's that quote, I think it was Escoffier who said, that all the animals feed, but the human is the only one that eats, and that's this got an important distinction. When we eat, we aren't simply shoving things down our throat as fuel. It's cultural, it's aesthetic, it's emotional, it's all these things. So if you deny the intellectual, you're just being like an animal. On the other hand, if you deny the animal, you're pretending to be something you're not, because we are not disembodied souls who just by accident happen to occupy bodies. Our nature is one which is a fully embodied one. And so that way I thought, actually addressing issues of how we ought to live through a subject where you just cannot get away from the physicality was very important. And that contains certain kind of risks and benefit, because again, one of the things I think people find that, and I found this too, one of the difficulties in writing about this is it's very easy to end up sounding pretentious when you're writing about food, because it is true, at the end of the day, it is connected to such basic functions. But that's kind of good, because that's part of the way in which, you know, when you're thinking about food and writing about food and philosophizing about food, you are forced to remain grounded, if you like, because there are all sorts of things that will come back to remind you that, you know, this involves very basic animal processes.
Delighted to hear that. Good defence by my lights, and this is probably the ideal opportune moment to hear more about our relation to other animals through Naomi Sykes. So stay here and we'll let Naomi come and join you.
Okay, thanks.
Come join.
Okay, so I guess you're all wondering what an archaeologist is doing in the room. Let me get that down. So, as Barry said, I am an archaeologist, but I work particularly on, there we go, the study of human-animal relationships. I study archaeological animal bones to try and ask questions about past cultures. And what I'm going to do in this talk is kind of reflect upon your book, but also thinking about how we can use archaeological data to perhaps try and understand some of the issues of the present. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit, kind of reflect on your book based on my own experience, because when I was reading this, and you can see that it's got lots of labels from when I was reading it, it brought back lots of memories from a food experiment that I did a few years ago with my family, where we, when we were drunk, we came up with this clever idea of trying to exist and explore the notion of local by eating food that was produced only within 2 miles of our house. When we sobered up, it was a really stupid idea, because we realised that no alcohol was produced within 2 miles of our house, nor was any chocolate or coffee or all of these things that we enjoy so much. And what we discovered was kind of what's written in your book about how complex the food system is today. And when you throw archaeology into the mix and consider things in deep time, it just becomes even more complex. I mean, this is something that you picked up in your book, and you said, you know, don't forget, of course, you know, carrots were introduced by the Romans, and that's true, but, you know, lots of other things happened in the past, and it's worth reflecting upon that. And that's what I'm going to do in this next slide. I want to take you through the last 10,000 years of human-animal interdependence, because you've been talking about Aristotle just in this discussion, but, you know, Aristotle in many ways is a worldview that's very similar to our own, very easy to understand. Take away, you know, go a few thousand years beyond that and we're kind of lost, and the way that people interact with animals is very, very different. So the data that I've got up here, I've just quickly brought together information about human life expectancies from the Mesolithic, so 10,000 years ago when people were hunter-gatherers, all the way through the Neolithic when they first become farmers, all the way up to the post-medieval period. Then I've done the same thing for cattle. We've now got good amounts of data from other zoo archaeologists, and we can look to see how animal life expectancies have changed. And I'm using cattle as a sort of the animal. So that's these two ones here. The last graph at the bottom, I wanted to look at issues of how much meat people have eaten through history. And this is something that we can do now through something called stable isotope analyses. So the premise of stable isotope analysis is that you are what you eat, quite literally. So everything that you eat is taken into your body and used as building blocks for your bones and your teeth and your skin and your hair. So if I was to pluck a hair from Barry's head, I could analyse it and work out everything that Barry's been eating. In his case, it's wine. But we can do this with the archaeological record as well. We can look at human stable isotopes, and the one that I've got here is, here we are, nitrogen, which tells us about how much protein, animal protein, is in the human diet. So let's now run through 10,000 years of human-animal interdependence. So starting with the Mesolithic, we can see that life expectancies weren't too bad. Okay, 25 years might not sound that bad, but on the scale of things, it's not awful. And when we look at cattle, their lives weren't too bad either. We're looking at an average of about 3 to 6 years that these cattle were living. They were wild. These were the wild aurochs, which is now completely extinct. And maybe cattle lived quite long lives because people weren't eating them that much. If you look here at the nitrogen levels, people weren't eating a huge amount of meat. And this isn't because, in your book you're like, people were desperately hungry all the time. The hunter-gatherers were fine. They were lazy folk. They did nothing other than go out hunting occasionally and spend the rest of their time kind of in leisure, as many hunter-gatherer societies do today. But look what happens when we move into the Neolithic. We see this increase in the amount of animal protein that people are eating. Now, this probably isn't meat, it's dairying, because this is when milking was invented. Clever people came up with the concept of milking animals. And you can see this reflected in both the cattle and the human life expectancies, because as you quite rightly say in your book, and you kind of chastise all of those ethical vegetarians who eschew meat but eat loads of milk, thinking that, that's fine, no one has to die. But of course, calves are the byproduct of the dairying industry, and I must tell you, I'm one of those awful vegetarians. So we see that there are lots of calves who are killed in order to release milk for human consumption. But what's really interesting is that we see the same thing happening with the humans. Now, the reason for this is because humans were not set up to digest cattle milk. This is something that happened, and the reason that we can drink it now is because of these people. Large numbers of children had to die in order for us to be able to drink milk. It's a mutation in our genetics. So all of you who are lactose tolerant, you have them to thank. And what this reflects is that the Neolithic and these data that we see here are a perfect example of human-animal co-evolution, where we wouldn't be in the situation that we are today were it not for those cattle. We have changed as a result of them. And I think what these data really show is that humans and animals have had something of a partnership for a really long time. And if you look at these aging data, you can see how life expectancies of both humans and animals have risen and fallen and risen together. That blew my mind when I brought these data together for the first time. And what I see in this is almost like when you run a marathon and you've got your pal there with you and you're kind of looking at each other and you're going, "You're all right?" And you're like, "Yeah, I'm all right." And they're looking to, the humans and the animals are looking to each other, "Are you all right?" "Yeah, we're getting there." Until you get to the end of the line and you're like, "I think I can win this." So what happens next is the equivalent of the humans going, "I can win this," pushing over the cattle, leaping on them, and so that they can launch and get further over the finish line. Because look what happens into the post-medieval period. Humans go off into the heady heights of 40 years of life expectancy, and of course now we have a life expectancy of 80 years. Whereas look, for the first time we see a bifurcation, and those cattle are average age 6 to 12 months, because they're being killed at economically optimal times. They're being exploited for the first time rather than being partners. And we can see where that exploitation goes when we look at the amount of protein that's in the human diet. This is the moment where things go horribly wrong, I believe. You might not all believe that, and of course this is a very rosy tint to it. But if I was to kind of look along this spectrum, I would be saying that, okay, this in the Mesolithic is where I want to be. This is the kind of human-animal relationship where, we live long enough, they live long enough, we don't eat them too much. And I'm really interested in wild animals. This is not something that you've looked at that much in this book, but you certainly did use them as okay, if they live a life as good as a wild animal, then that's okay. So let's move then to what I really want to talk about, which is the concept of fair game, and whether there can ever be a concept of fair game, which is through the work that I've been doing on the fallow deer. Now, these are the spotty deer that you might see if you visit a stately home, looking all pretty on lawns. Now, they're not actually native to Britain. They're not native to most of the world. They're from a small area in the Mediterranean. But over the last 8,000 years, they have gone global. They're now the most widely distributed deer species on the planet. And our project has been trying to understand what all this means in terms of human-animal relationships. I'm not going to bore you with the archaeology too much, but when we were doing this project, we realised that our work had actually some implications for the present day issues of deer management. So let me give you a wee bit of background about this. This relates just to England, and the work that I do relates only to England and shouldn't be applied anywhere else. But the information I've taken is ripped off the deer initiative. At the moment, we have 6 species of deer in England. We've got the red deer and the roe deer, which are considered to be native, although the genetics would sort of suggest this might not be the case so much these days. Then we've got sika, muntjac and Chinese water deer, all introduced in the last couple of 100 years, and therefore considered bad because they're invasive. Coming over here, taking our, I don't know, the place of our deer. And then we've got the fallow deer, which is has a respectable enough antiquity to be considered okay. So there's a wee bit of animal racism going on here, but this is the deal. A lot of NGOs believe that now deer are more widely distributed than any time in the last 1,000 years. I don't know how they know this. I don't know this, and I work on this stuff, but I think that they're probably fairly accurate. So we've got a lot of deer. Every year, about 350,000 are culled. And to that, we can add about 70,000 which are killed in road traffic accidents. This includes human fatalities as well. There are a few that come every year as a result. So despite all of these cullings and despite the deaths due to a road traffic accident, wild deer populations are still increasing. And this is becoming something of a management issue. The thing is that, these deer are still culled, but in the UK there is no market for wild venison at all. And in fact, most of it is exported. And I wonder, why is this the case? And I think I have some of the answers. I think one of the reasons why this is the case is because of this. Oh, lovely deer. Do you ever cook these in your restaurant? You monster! You monster! So everybody looks at these and thinks that, it's so cruel to kill Bambi. But, why is this more cruel than killing any livestock? As we were saying earlier, if ethics and organic and free range are your bag, then you don't get more free range or organic or I suppose ethical than venison. So I would try to dismiss this. I think that there's no excuse to say that it's more cruel to eat venison than anything else. The other reason I think that people don't like venison, and I'm now really wishing that I hadn't put in this slide, especially as it's being recorded, is this. I think this is one of the reasons why people don't like venison. Because, rightly or wrongly, when people think about venison and think about hunting, they think of this. They think of fox hunting. You only need to look at the news recently where I suppose even myself included, found it difficult to extrapolate Prince William's actions, where he was saving African wildlife on the one hand and then blowing wild boar off the face of the planet on the other. People see it all as the same thing. I don't necessarily agree with this view. However, it does have grains of truth in it. And this is sort of the things that you were saying in your book, that there are some things that do have some truth in them, but it becomes a bit garbled. So we can look to the archaeological record to show those grains of truth. What I'm showing in this slide is how well represented wild ungulates are through time, from the Iron Age over on the left all the way through to the medieval period. And I've broken this down by site type as well, so social status. So green bars are rural, red is urban, you have military in blue, elite in purple, and then religious establishments in sort of light blue. And what you should be able to see is that there is very much a deep time connection between the elite and hunting. It's no coincidence that these periods, so we've got the Roman is this first blip here, and then the medieval here, were times of very hierarchical societies. It's no coincidence that these were periods when machoism and being militarily active were also really high priorities. These were periods of imperialism, Roman Empire, Norman Empire, and so on. And these were also periods similar to Aristotle, where it was believed that humans had dominion over the natural world, that it was their right to kind of suppress it and bring it to order. But this has not always been the case. We can look to what's either side of the Roman period, and people's worldviews were really, really different. We see very little evidence for any kind of hunting, certainly no elite hunting culture. And when we do find wild animals, they're nearly always in votive contexts. buried with people. And when we look at the iconography, such as this beautiful panel from the Gunderstrik cauldron, we can see that there's no real nature-culture divide that we see today, that animals and humans are kind of commingled together. And also, it's just a very, very different worldview that in some ways, I think our present-day worldview kind of fits with this in terms of wild animal exploitation. We see it as something sacred and not to be exploited. But the problem is that doesn't actually fit with what's going on around us. So I'm going to show you that through the fallow deer, because again, it's no coincidence that these deer were introduced in these two periods, again, of imperialism and hunting. We have an introduction in the Roman period, and then our genetic work shows that they all go extinct, all of them. We then get a new reintroduction sometime in the 11th century, and all the deer of the fallow deer that we have in the country today relate to this particular introduction. What comes along with those fallow deer is this hunting culture that transformed everything that was going on in the medieval period. Hunting was the pop culture of its time. We see it in the art and in the literature. The landscape was transformed with parks being established, and law also changed as well. So many of the institutions that we have are legal frameworks relating to hunting descend from this medieval period. But what's kind of nice is that venison was really respected in this period, and we can see this from what they did to the deer when they caught it. When you killed a deer, you didn't just kind of like throw it on the back of your donkey and take it home. There were all of these rituals that surrounded the death and the butchery and the skinning of the animal. First of all, you rolled it onto its back, you skinned it, there was a lot of performance, and then certain parts of the body were given to different people. So the haunches went back to the lord. The left shoulder would go to the forester or the parker as his fee for supporting the hunt, and the right shoulder would go to the best hunter. Other bits went to other people, but there's not enough time to explain that. And this really happened because we can see it in the zoo archaeological record. What we see here is that the elite certainly did get the haunches. When we look at Parker's residences, we find just the forelimbs, and when we can tell what side they are, they're always from the left. And rural sites, although there's never that much venison on these lower status sites, they're always the shoulders and they're always from the right-hand side. So what we're seeing is that these people are being given meaty symbols of their social position. When you bring it back together, it's the complete animal. So meaty symbols of social position, which in some way shows that people had a social position, but they had a social position within a community, and that's something really, really nice. The animals, the idea of coming together to redistribute an animal and eat it as a group, it's a beautiful thing, and it shows real respect for that animal. But it wasn't all positive. With many sort of positive things comes many awful things. And of course, this medieval legacy of hunting also brought to extinction almost the red deer and the roe deer in England. It wiped out completely all fallow deer, wild boar across all of Britain, and took with it all of the predators, the wolves, the bears, and the lynx that actually would predate these things. So something of a problem here as a result. And it gets worse when we see what happens with people and how they respond to this. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the dangers of elite-led food fashions, which is what we have here. So this is in the period when people start hunting and considering that this is a good thing, with venison equals land, and that is seen to equal power. And we see everybody kind of gets on board with this. So in the next period, the elite really, really want to demonstrate how much power and how much land they've got. So they do everything they can to increase the numbers of wild animals that they can eat. This is by keeping fallow deer in parks, it's by bringing to extinction the predators. However, as all of the lower classes see what the upper classes are doing, they go, but we want some of this. We want to demonstrate our power by having venison. So they start to seek it out as well, and it percolates down into the lower social classes. But the elite don't like that because they want to stay one step ahead, and they don't want people acting in the same way as them. So they abandon hunting and they abandon the hunting culture. And then the lower classes who were emulating them go, wait a minute, they've stopped eating venison. We shouldn't eat it either. So they stop eating venison. The parks fall into disrepair, the deer escape, but they don't go away. They're still there in the landscape. And then if you look at the present day, no one is still eating venison, but the deer are still here. So we have this problem with wild deer. And this is again cribbed from the Deer Initiative. You know, they say that, you know, everybody loves deer. We want them to be part of our landscape. But when they become into sort of large densities, they do problems to the environment, and they can do problems to themselves by just there not being enough food for them to go around. They make the case that, you know, sustainable deer management has this product of venison as a result, and it's all of the things that we said. It's low food miles, it's low impact, it generates economies in local areas. Another reason why we should be eating it is because it's terribly healthy. If you look here at the details, that's very high protein, very low fat by comparison to all other animals. And to some extent, the message is getting through, but it's garbled. So I saw this in a recent magazine, and let me just take you through what I felt as I was reading it. Waitrose meat buyer Andy Bolton told Meat News that venison has been a significant growth area, and I read that and went, brilliant, that's good news. And then he said that we want to supply all year round. And I went, what? All year round, but it's kind of seasonal, that's really, really important. And then it says, so, you know, we'll go to farms and get farmed deer, and we'll use that. And I'm like, farmed deer? Why do you want farmed deer? None of this relates to farmed deer, and when you start farming deer, they are like livestock and they get fat, and therefore they're not healthy in the same way. And then it says, and there are only 100 deer farms in Britain, so we're having to go to New Zealand to import it. So this like blows my mind that we've got all of this wild venison that we are exporting, and then in return we've got all of this stuff that comes in that we're importing. It just, I don't know if the ethics of this are right or wrong. I'm not a philosopher, it just strikes me as being a bit mental. So what I want to do is try and change this. And my way of doing this is not starting from the top and working down, but going the other way, because I think, you know, all too often we preach and it gets garbled, like we see with the Meat News. So I wanted to sort of roll up my sleeves, democratise venison, and try and make a bit of a difference, because venison, wild venison, is also very cheap. So it's a good food. So what we do is we drag fallow deer carcasses that have been culled by a stalker that I work with, and we take them, in this particular case, to inner city schools. And we get them to unmake the deer following the medieval hunting rituals. And we ask them to see the whole process through. We explain to them the situation. We talk them through the ethics of some of this. And we get them involved in the skinning, the disarticulation, through to butchery, through the cooking, and then into the consumption. And in fact, the whole school gets venison stew for a couple of days afterwards. And what I feel is that these children get so much more out of this by seeing the whole process through. And it's something that kind of comes back to that local food experiment. Although it was horrible, and I never ever want to do it again, what I learnt from it was that although we were really hungry when we did our local food experiment, it didn't feel like it, because we were eating all of these things that came from people that we knew. And I'm beginning to think that memories and knowledge about food are almost a source of dietary protein, that they make you feel full up. And I think that kind of comes back to something that you say in your book. You had a discussion with Barry, and you said, you know, oh, people binge on donuts, and you eat one, you go, that didn't work, give me another one. But that's because there's nothing, you know, they are empty calories. There's nothing attached to that. And I think that this is the kind of thing that can help and make a difference. I can't do it just by myself with a few schools or going to pubs. So what we've done, we're really lucky that we got quite a lot of attention from what we were doing. And the National Trust, who have an awful lot of properties with an awful lot of deer associated with them, heard about what we were doing and have always been terrified about broaching the issue of culling deer, because they think that people will burn their properties down. When they found out that they weren't reacting really badly to us, they came on board. And so over the last year, we've been training deer managers, teaching them about our process. And recently, over the last few months, we've actually held public unmakings in National Trust properties where members of the public can come along and have a go and be involved in this. They're also starting to sell their venison cheaply through their gift shops and in their cafes. So I think that these sorts of things are maybe starting to make a difference. So what I want to I said that I was going to talk to you about the novrati. In your book, you talk about how you've come up with a new kind of fast I kind of wondered if we could crib that and have a new kind of attitude to venison. you know, I don't really think that the shooting or consumption of wild deer is any sort of more or less ethical than the slaughter of livestock. I don't think that venison should necessarily be a food of the elite either. In the Roman period, it was considered res nullius, so it belonged to nobody. And why should it belong to anybody? If it belongs to no one, it should belong to everybody. So we've started to see that venison is being used in our county council, at least, as part of school dinners, which I think is excellent, with venison coming from Sherwood Forest. If you wanted to get hold of some stuff that has been sort of created and gathered with love and respect, you could do worse than checking out the Lincolnshire Deer Group, which is a group of deer stalkers. They're working class people who go and manage the deer, and you can buy it through their online shop. Or you can go to the National Trust and go to Hatfield Forest or Belton House, Charlecott or Attingham, where they're all selling this venison. I hope that I've shown that, you know, food fashions have the ability to be environmentally disastrous if we're not careful. And so the advice that I'm giving now is really for now. If anything I say catches on, we need to stop instantly, because it doesn't take very long for animals to be overhunted. We've seen it in the past, and actually in Denmark, hunting is a bit of an issue. I think that wildlife is slightly depleted as a result of hunting. So it's context specific, and that's what makes it even more complex than the things that you're talking about. But I think what I'd like to say more than anything else is that we should consider that animals are not just these sort of commodities, that they're actually partners and have been for a very long time. If nothing else, we should think of them as gifts. So, and when somebody gives you a gift, you know, you say thank you and you're grateful for it. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I'm very grateful to have been here.
Julian, do you want to reflect briefly on that?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, because we've got some more interesting things to hear about. You know, it's really interesting. I mean, it raised so many interesting issues. And I think one of them, you made a point earlier. You said you said you're one of those awful vegetarians. I mean, perhaps just clarify that a bit. What I was really arguing in the book is that if you are a vegetarian on the grounds of concern for animal welfare, but you're a lacto-vegetarian or fish-eating vegetarian, then there are certain inconsistencies. Now, I would like to point out that I do think it's better to be someone who is essentially making a good effort to reduce animal suffering and not going around buying certain meats than just not caring at all. So from that point of view, I'm not saying vegetarians are the bottom of the mould scrap heap at all, but there are these issues, and as you say, the issues are because, you know, you have to kill bull calves in order to get dairy milk. And also, yeah, if you're not being very careful about where your milk comes from, you may be getting it from cows which are having very miserable lives. I think it's about 25 to a third of the dairy cows in Britain are lame because of the conditions they're in. So, yeah, at the very least, you need to be making sure that the herds you're getting your milk from are well looked after herds, because, you know, the life of a well-reared beef cow is going to be better than that of a not well-reared dairy cow. So those are the issues around that. But I think this whole issue of, and it came up, perhaps I'll stick to this one point before moving on. In various ways in your talk, showing the history and everything, you're showing about this kind of relationship that humans have with the animals that they eat or don't eat at the time. And I think that is something which is very easy to lose and very difficult to understand when you're basically have an urban upbringing. I mean, I grew up in a small town and we're very far from the land. And when you meet good farmers, for example, you see they have this very profound relationship with their livestock. Yeah, they don't like the day when they send them off to the slaughterhouse. They feel sad about it. You know, they do get to know their animals and everything. There's a documentary film called The Moo Man, which is very interesting from this point of view. If you've never sort of like had any relationship or seen farmers, it really gets some sense of how there is this relationship where there is one of, like, you know, care and stewardship and compassion, which is entirely compatible with the eating and the killing, and in some way tied up with it. And from this point of view, the philosophical text I would most recommend for this is actually Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, which I read many years ago, and as I was reading it, I was a bit disappointed. I wasn't really engaged with it, but I found it's one of those books that, having read it, something really stuck in my mind from it, because it seemed to me to capture brilliantly this sense in which you can be a human being who has this extremely deep relationship with the animals, which in this sense he's kind of in competition and in cooperation with, and their fates are intertwined. And I think you get a tremendous insight into that from that. And that's a good example actually of how, you know, I think you can do philosophy through fiction actually, because what it can get us to do is to attend to those aspects of the phenomena we're exploring in ways which bring to the light the salient features, sometimes in ways in which just an analytic argument can't do. So I won't say any more about that, but I do think that's a really, really important thing to try and get to grips with if we're truly to understand a truly ethical, moral relationship to animals. Does require us to understand a little bit more deeply what our relationship to them is, and not simply to have a kind of a sanitized or, you know, Disneyfied sort of version, which is that either animals are roaming free and skipping around the fields having happy lives, you know, or they're being exploited by human beings. In fact, animals can be well looked after by human beings who nonetheless kill them, and in the wild, I mean, well, you only have to watch any kind of a David Attenborough documentary to recognise that the fate of an animal in the wild is not one of unrelenting peace and harmony. But I'll leave it there because I'll give it here from.
Right. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Julian. And now we'll hear from Ben Reade. Thank you. Ben.
Oh, cheers. I brought some slides, so let's see if I stick to them. The basic idea that I'd like to talk about today is being driven by the senses and looking at how the senses have developed in order to enable us to do that for our own benefit. And I'd like to take the starting point, I think actually lifting off where Naomi left actually, with looking at the way that humans and plant life and animal life are so interconnected, and thinking about how actually, in order, if there is some kind of ethical obligation that we have, looking after our health and looking after the world around us is very much one and the same thing. Now, I'd like to start with this first little exercise where you think of the most delicious thing you can possibly think of. You think of something that's absolutely your own personal ambrosial nectar. And you think about the way that smells, and you think about the way that feels in your mouth. You think about swallowing it. I'm a bit obsessive about food, so I would compare that almost orgasmic feeling when you suddenly swallow something like that. And then think about eating that same food every single lunch, dinner, breakfast for the rest of your life. It suddenly becomes completely disgusting. And I think this is one of the simplest ways of illustrating the importance of diversity. So diversity in nature, diversity in our diets, and they both correspond to each other very, very closely. And here I've got a phylogenetic tree of kind of a lot of really, really common agricultural crops. And if what we're doing as well in Nordic Food Lab, where I'm working, is doing a lot of work to kind of analytically look at the nature around us and see what is edible. So we might start by looking at a tree like this and think, well, okay, so what mushrooms have we got? What lichens have we got? What mammals have we got? What fish have we got? And really trying to look at it group by group. And then often we can find things that are next to each other. And we don't eat one, but we do eat the other. And we don't necessarily know why, so that perhaps gives us new avenues to investigate. Or we find that someone is eating something on the other side of the planet which is so closely related to something we have on our own back gardens, and we don't necessarily realise, that we can eat it. A lot of these things tie into a concept of sustainability, and I think in order to get people interested in the idea of what's good to eat, it's almost imperative to not talk about sustainability. Actually, it's so unsexy, it's a complete turn-off. And the fact of the matter is very few people actually understand what it means. So what we do a lot of the time is trying to give people ideas or feed them pieces of information which in some way enable people to come to their own conclusions about what they believe is right in food. So I have a really firm belief actually that we're designed to be able to eat properly from our environments. And the more and more you consider the kind of sense organs that we have, the more and more you realize how deeply connected they are with the foods that we have around us. And that often comes down to quite a localized level. So some people in the world have specific taste capacities or incapacities which correlate directly with ingredients around them. Like one really clear example would be in sub-Saharan Africa, the presence of sickle cell anemia, and finding that people with this genetic predisposition have the inability to taste the bitter compounds from some manioc and cassava. And what that does is it means that they can eat manioc cassava that's not been detoxified, and these cyanogenic glycosides go into their blood, which then makes the blood completely uninhabitable to malaria virus. So you can see really, really clearly the way that, like, human evolution has enabled people to survive, but through the taste. And so I think this idea of a biological basis for aesthetics is a really, really interesting one to explore further. And looking at how much our taste is developed in order to find nutrients, in order to find calories in our environment, in order to steer us away from toxins. It's a really fascinating area of study. But I wanted to talk with the idea of this phylogenetic tree and this idea of exploring the diversity that we have about a particular vice of mine, and it's mangoes. Like, I really love a good mango. I've always loved a good mango. And when we're told to diversify our diets, when we're told to eat lots of different things, and when we often get involved in this kind of culinary one-upmanship that you were talking about, we start thinking about diversifying the diet. So here we've got lots of fancy tropical fruit, and it's really, really easy to think when I bring my mango in that I'm somehow diversifying my diet. Because of course, before I didn't have a mango and now I have one more thing. But actually once we start looking at the real concept of diversity, we realize it's all to do with complex interactions, and actually looking at where all those mangoes came from is these massive tracts of land in Pakistan, which are, you know, all growing exactly the same mango. So we start to look at, you know, what if we don't have that mango? We start to look into our own back gardens, and we inevitably discover new things. So that then leads us to discover, I don't know, using carrot and sea buckthorn together, which we have available to us in our own back gardens. And that means that then when I travel somewhere else in the world, I'm not eating the same Alfonso mango from Pakistan, but actually I'm eating whatever it is they found in their back gardens. So you're increasing your diversity treble-fold and increasing the sort of complex interactions between us and as humans and the species around us to an enormous degree. So I'm working here in Copenhagen, and I've shaded in the Nordic bit of the map, and obviously what we're dealing with here is a kind of revolution in food that's happened there. It's a big kind of movement from this very Protestant opinion of eating food and enjoying yourself being kind of a bit twisted into something where it's a completely valuable thing to do, and it's good for your health, and it's good for the soil and the animals around you. But I think what it links into, perhaps more than any idea of local cuisine, is what we have to think of is regional cuisine. And actually the region is not correlating with distance. If you turn Norway upside down, it goes past Sicily. So if I'm getting sea urchins from the north of Norway because they're outstanding, and they play a part in the cultural identity of the Scandinavian or Nordic region, it's not local in the slightest. It's much more local for me to go to Liguria and get the same thing. Or it's not the same thing, but I could get sea urchins from Liguria. So actually starting to look at food identity and cultural identity, as in tied into this idea of regionality rather than locality, I think we start to explore some slightly more complex themes. And again, anything like this that we want to explore, it does really quickly become very, very complicated. And suddenly rules don't count, and suddenly they are only sort of rules of thumb that you can live by if you're in a rush. But I wanted to kind of talk about, in terms of way of life, in terms of cultural identity, the whole idea of diet, and the way that now our concept of diet is very much based on a concept of nutrition, and it's very much based on a concept of milligrams of zinc in whatever it is we're eating. In fact, the history of the word diet is much more about the way of life. So when you talk about the Mediterranean diet, the reason everyone's living so long is the fact they're growing their vegetables and walking to grow them and picking wild things. It is in part also due to the fact that they are eating specific foods, but it's much more to do with everything that surrounds it, perhaps. And I think there's a Harvard professor called Stephen Shapin who's done a lot of research into this, and I find it absolutely fascinating. When we start to look at the shift in culture from understanding good diet as understanding a way of being good in the world, from that to this nutrition-based idea, where suddenly what's important is the micronutrients and macronutrients within whatever it is you're eating, and much less concentration on the way of life and whatever it is that brought that food to you or you to the food. So, and I think you've touched on this really nicely with the Waitrose clip, that it's really easy to give people ideas that a certain ingredient or a certain branding is somehow good for them or good for the planet. Actually, the essence of it is much, much, much more complex. There's no such thing as an ingredient which is inherently good or bad. It's the human systems which surround it which make it so. So here we've got some Chianina cows in Tuscany. It's a massive breed of cow. It's what you have, your bistecca fiorentina comes from that. And looking at cows, they're kind of demonized a little bit just now, actually. People are going, oh, well, they produce too much greenhouse gases or things like this. But actually, a cow can add a massive amount to closed cycle agriculture. It can provide meat and milk for a family for a whole year with one cow. Or maybe milk one year and meat the next. But they provide power to a lot of the world, and that's perhaps why in your tables at the early stages of domestication of cattle, actually not much was being eaten, because they were seen as muscle machines and not as food. But to look at that and then compare it to these feedlots, this is a recent photograph which I'm afraid I've just pulled off the internet, but these are feedlots and all the effluent running into a pool. So all you're doing there is introducing the same animal into a completely different system, where you're not only ruining that land, the cow's life, the Amazon where you grow the soy to feed them with, but you're also ruining the lives of the people who eat these things. And the difference is between this cow and these poor beings here is also the kinds of distribution and systems which surround it afterwards. And the amount of cow, or the amount of beef, which a system like this encourages you to eat is completely different. And that has very, very direct impacts, of course, on people's health. The health of the land, the health of the animals. So again, we see these things being really, really interconnected. So we recently got a big grant, which we're super happy to have, from the Velux Foundation, to look at edible insects. And what we wanted to do is, there was all this fuss about edible insects, a lot of people talking about it, a lot of people involved in sustainability studies and life cycle studies and things like this, talking about how these were the foods of the future and how it made complete ecological sense. And we thought, well, yeah, that's interesting, but is anyone studying how to make them taste good? No. So that was the essence of what we found, is that actually, yes, you can find a record of, you know, how someone in Mexico might fry them, but really a true gastronomic study in the sense of what someone like Briand Savarin or Escoffier would approve of was impossible to find. So currently we're undertaking a lot of field work. So I've just come back from Kenya and Uganda, where we've been looking at lots and lots of fascinating edible insects there. And I think, to me, there's something. Well, what we found when we were in, especially Uganda, is not what we were expecting to find. So we went out there looking for recipes. We went out there looking for culinary knowledge. We went out there to record how people already eat them. We went out there to look at the place within cuisine that these things have, what people eat when they eat them, what people don't eat when they eat them, when they eat them, what the seasons are, what the times of day are, and to understand the culinary context of these things. And here we've got Tom, right? Tom's in the province of central Uganda, and he's standing there on a termite mound. And this is one of probably 5 termite mounds within about 20 paces of each other. These things are pretty big, and each one of these termite mounds can produce a harvest of they say 50 kilos, but I don't quite believe that because termites don't weigh very much. But basically a considerable amount of protein. You can see, well, I can see because I know where it is, but no, there's no chance you're going to see that. But there's a little funnel which is sticking out of that termite mound, which is about the size of my pinky. And actually that is some African stingless bees, which they go in through this tunnel, and then they have these underground chambers full of the most incredible honey you could possibly come across. The magic of these termites is they're also farming mushrooms. So you have this termitomyces mushrooms, and each different type of termite is farming a different type of mushroom. These mushrooms are some of the biggest edible mushrooms on the planet. Like a cap of one can be like this. They're really, really huge. There's lots of other species living in there. And also, there's ants and plants and everything's growing around these termite mounds. The termite mound itself, when a termite mound collapses, it makes an amazing place to plant a mango tree or a papaya tree. The soil is incredible, and the roots really love it. It's also used by pregnant women for eating because it's so rich in various minerals, and it makes really good fertilizer as well for the fields once the termite mound collapses. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk about various places in the world. I mean, almost everywhere in the world eats too much protein. But there are some places like Uganda, for example, where the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization does recommend that actually you up consumption a little bit. So I wanted to think about the ways that people are offering to do that. So one of the major ways is doing, for example, hybrid maize. And everyone in Uganda is growing a type of maize called Longe H6, which is especially bred to have a higher protein content. And what we saw is some incredible biodiverse farming methods with really, really conscious people, like Tom, for example, who had lots and lots of species growing in small in small spaces. And they're not growing this Longe H6. And they're very healthy, and they're very happy, and they're living in beautiful places. We also came across people who'd invested huge amounts of money taking out bank loans for Longe H6. After it just come on the market, everyone got really, really excited about it. This new, massively productive type of maize. everyone took out loans. The current market price was 600 shillings a kilo, and a kilo, is that right? I can't remember. Whatever, it was 600 shillings, and then everyone invested, everyone grew, the harvest was massive, and of course the paradox of a bumper harvest meant that the price shot down to 120 shillings for the same quantity, and no one could repay their loans. So basically then the banks walked in and they took all that land. Now, someone like Tom, what he's done is he's got all these things planted around, and he still has these termite mounds. So he has 4 or 5 within 20 paces of each other. That's a massive source of protein. But if you look at it from this reductionist perspective, you go and you plough the whole thing flat, and you put this maize, which is then subject to international market fluctuations, and which very, very easily leaves people starving. So I think this reductionist perspective, especially in terms of agriculture, has just again and again shown us what a ridiculous idea it is to be too minded about tech solutions. So I wanted to I kind of know what's going on with edible insects. I meet a lot of people who are in it, and there's definite people who are of this reductionist perspective, who they're very, very willing to use, for example, something like the idea of the sustainability, the low carbon imprint. You can if you feed a cow, depending on where you are and what you feed it, but basically if you feed it 10 parts, you get 3 parts of meat. If you feed a pig the same, you get about 4 or 5 parts. Chicken, I think, is about 4 or 5 as well. I forget exact figures. But if you feed a locust, for example, you get 9 parts. So from 10, you get 9. And this, of course, is great in terms of like reductionist economics. But there's a lot of people using that for spin, and what they actually are using these ideas for spin for is to project a world where you can computerize the production of, for example, crickets, because they're so predictable. You can put that anywhere you want in the world in a container, and it can be, in fact, on a ship floating in the middle of nowhere, if you like. You can feed these things antibiotics prophylactically, because you know that you need to prevent medicines when you have prevent illnesses when you have such dense populations. Then what they propose is to separate different fractions of the insect. So actually one of the major incomes from, for example, these farmed crickets will be biodiesel. I can't quite get over that personally. Like, I think like breeding animals to run our cars is really sick and twisted. Then what they'll do is they'll take the protein component and feed that to pigs and chickens. And some of it will be squashed into nondescript chunks and sold to parts of the world where chicken is an unaffordable luxury. I think perhaps one of the things which is driving this is this idea that, there's a huge amount of the world which is developing very, very fast. There's a massively increasing middle class who have this demand for meat, or for protein at least. And if we have that in a world where we're recognizing that already we have too much meat consumption in almost all of the world, and the World Food Programme, for example, reckons that we have enough food for 12 billion people already on the planet, then perhaps what we should be doing is getting people to lower the demand, rather than just trying to fill the demand with another protein source. And I think perhaps the strongest way to get people to lower their protein consumption is get them to come to terms with death. So this is a sheep which is having its throat slit. It's perhaps not the most humane way of killing a sheep, but I think that people are not really aware of the idea that this was an animal, cute or otherwise, which then bled and died for you to eat it. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most potent ideas that can be possibly communicated for the future of food, is the idea that if you want to eat meat, that involves death. Now, I've been a vegetarian for 13 years. I'm brought up by vegetarian parents. I've worked in a vegetarian restaurant for 4 years. My parents are still vegetarian. I barely buy meat. But I also am willing to kill things. I also understand what I'm doing when I'm eating meat. And I think this is perhaps something that should be almost forced upon people who want to come to terms with that. I think in terms of, one of the examples that's got everyone so riled up recently, and being in Denmark, of course, we've kind of seen it a bit more, was these photographs of the Faroe Islands with the blood in the sea. Now, of course, blood in the sea makes a massive expanse, bright red, and like it or not, killing things produces blood. It's just when it happens behind closed doors with pigs, you have 5 litres of blood per pig, which is being flushed down the drain most of the time. In Denmark, you have 20 million pigs, that's 5 times the population. And every single day, you have 25,000 of those pigs, which are dying as a kind of mortality rate. They're not being killed for meat. You have 25,000 pigs every single day dying of stress, neglect, and other things. So it's really, really crazy. And that's why I think that, like, going back to, like, people like Tom, who basically understand complex interactions and who are not about to go and plough down their termite fields and their termite mounds in exchange for planting market crops, is a really good idea. I wanted to finish with a little story. I went to the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy, which was founded by Slow Food, and I got to know, very fortunately, I got to know Carlo Petrini, the founder of Slow Food, quite well. And at one point we were driving together through Spain, between Tarragona and Pamplona, which is basically a desert. There's nothing there except solar panels. And the car broke down. And we were in the middle of nowhere, and we ended up in a garage, like a roadside Little Chef kind of type place. And we were waiting there for hours for a mechanic. And this is one of the most famous gastronomes on the planet. He's a kind of, I would say, a modern equivalent of Briand Savarin of some description. And, we're sitting there for a while. Eventually we get hungry, and we're sitting in the Little Chef. What do? Well, you order food. And I think this is perhaps the key, to understanding these things, is that actually it doesn't matter at the end of the day. When you're hungry, you're going to eat. And the important thing is that people have enough food to eat when they're hungry. All the rest of it is add-ons. And actually, when it boils down to it, it's having enough food for everyone, which is the really important thing. And I think we can all have as many principles as we like, but we're all essentially, I speak for myself, I'm a hypocrite. I've seen the effects of non-Fairtrade coffee. And I've just come down on a train drinking non-Fairtrade coffee the whole way. And I think acknowledging that, the give and take, and acknowledging the fact that we have to, get policy to change, and get suppliers to change, get industry to change, in order to change what's around us, so that then even when we are hungry in Little Chef, then we can still find something half decent to eat. I think that's the only sort of reasonable future that we can hope for. So that's me. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thanks, Ben. Actually, are you sure that on train your coffee was not Fairtrade? Because actually, it's surprising how much Fairtrade coffee there is these days. Well, actually,
I say Fairtrade. Fairtrade's really interesting though, because it's a brand name, and because it has a fixed market price regardless of where you are on the planet. Often the market price of coffee can be higher than the Fairtrade price. Often. This is another complexity to add to the equation, is that because of the fluctuating price of coffee or chocolate, that often the fluctuating price is higher than the Fairtrade price.
You have 100% sure of that.
Yes.
I think you check that.
100% sure.
All right.
We were going to have Eileen from Fairtrade here. Is she here?
No.
Not here? Okay.
Not here.
Could have given us an answer to
that.
Yeah.
No, but this is fact.
Yeah. Okay, but let's can I just pick up? Actually, I had another question for you as well. Actually, which is you were talking early on about the sense in which our tastes are sort of good predictors. Now, there are kind of slightly conflicting ideas of that knocking around. I wonder what you could shed on. On the one hand, people say actually, if we just learn to listen to our stomachs, we kind of know what's good for us. We know what we need, and you can follow that. On the other hand, people say that we've evolved these things for times of shortage and when things weren't available, and that we now live in this obesogenic environment, they call it, where we can't trust these things anymore, because actually what we're doing is we keep getting these whiffs of things like sugar and salt, sugar and fat in particular, and we go, yeah, that's good, and we're overstocking on them. So to what extent actually can we just rely on our natural instincts and tastes to tell us what we need to eat, and to what extent do we need to sort of learn to compensate for their for certain features of the modern world, perhaps?
I think that there's, in Latin you say quote sapit nutrit, meaning what tastes good, what is sapid, nourishes. And that was was that Hume in his taste, standard of taste, I think, talks about that. But I think with relevant education, basically, you can change people's habits. If you feed people, there's something that's happening a lot just now, and that's people being brought up without exposure to bitterness. The way that the human body is designed to work with bitterness is by far the most complex sense of taste. You have one type of receptor for each other taste, and with bitterness you have between 30 and 35 different types of receptors. And that's because that's very much evolved to navigate an environment of extremely complex chemical toxins, often which are completely unrelated to each other chemically. So when you're born with a major aversion to bitterness. As you grow older, culture teaches you which things are toxins and which things are necessary for you to eat. Most antioxidants are also bitter, so most of our medicines, I mean, of course, the medicine poison continuum is one thing. So a lot of people are now growing up without being taught by culture which bitter things is possible to eat. And then they grow up with something which can be called taste infantilism, where basically you're an adult with a child's taste, where you still want to drink fizzy juice and, only Scottish people call Coke juice, but you still want to drink fizzy juice and eat chocolate bars when you're 35 years old, and really that should be something that you've stopped as you kind of stopped growing and your body started to deteriorate. You should be starting to get much more into bitter things because they're full of antioxidants which will stop you rusting. Mm-hmm. So I think if you have the correct exposure and the correct education in terms of food as at a young age, then it's pretty recognised that food habits are very, very different in later life, and then you're going to be much less likely to end up going down the road of type 2 diabetes or obesity or other food-related illnesses, heart disease, whatever else.
I mean, one of the things you said, which I very much endorse, is this very important to confront the fact that meat means death. And I think the extent to which that will lead to perhaps less consumption is probably right, because I think it teaches a certain respect, I think, for meat. And I think when you sort of know what's required to get your meat, it may not make you a vegetarian, but it makes you sort of appreciate more that there is a cost there, there's a value there. You don't just do it lightly. And the fact that, confronting it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to stop eating it. I mean, that was my experience, because in writing this book, I went to a slaughterhouse because I had gone from a position of not really eating meat at all, but being in this position of eating lots of dairy and things like that, and sort of realising from an animal welfare point of view there was a contradiction. And I was eating sort of well-reared animals. I wasn't sure about pigs, because pigs by reputation are very smart animals, and I heard all sorts of nasty stories about how pigs, know what's coming to them when they go to the slaughterhouse and everything. And I went to a slaughterhouse and I saw the pig being slaughtered, and actually seeing it made me content that it would be okay to eat a well-reared and well killed pig. Actually, it didn't do the other thing. It didn't. A lot of people report they go to a slaughterhouse and they can't eat meat, forevermore. For me, it did the other thing because it's confronting the reality of it. When it's done properly, it gives you a kind of respect, I think. And one of the people there who worked there, it's a model facility, I have to say. So I'm not saying all slaughterhouses would have been had the same effect as this one. A veterinary scientist said, he kind of agreed with you that he thought there should really be a license to eat meat, and to get your license to eat meat, you have to go and see the consequences of what it is you're doing. But perhaps one more point before I finish up, which I thought is a very important thing you pointed to, was this idea of systems versus reductionism. And I think this comes up in all sorts of things around food. Agriculture is one. So again, thinking that, that we realise that good agriculture is about growing food as part of a sustainable system. And when you go for these big monocultures, you try and narrow it down to we're just going to get this huge bit of land, we're going to strip it, we're going to put in one crop and give it what it needs to grow. It doesn't work. It also, I think, in terms of human nutrition, that's also very important as well, because human nutrition, I think there's a lot of evidence here that it has suffered from this thing you were talking about there, about the emphasis on micronutrients. So we've broken it down, and we now know you need this vitamin, that vitamin, this fat, that blah blah blah. And so you have these things listed on the side of packets of things, making them sound like they're perfectly balanced. But actually, when you've broken down your food in that way and then reassembled it, you no longer have something which you're actually very able to digest, and that the processes are very important. I think there are all sorts of interesting things around that, around bread, for example. It is interesting how a lot of people there is real intolerance to gluten and issues like that, but a lot of people anecdotally say, I gave up the wheat and I felt a lot better. And I actually wonder whether they're mistaking an artifact of the system for something about an ingredient, because actually most of the bread that we have is made by this Chorley wood process, which I'm sure you know more about than me. There's a sort of very industrialised, sort of fast, high yeast, fast sort of rise system for making bread, and actually there's some evidence, I think, that kind of bread is less easy to digest. If you then make a bread which is in a more traditional way, then actually that's easier to digest. And I think sometimes perhaps some people might be confusing the fact that when they're giving up wheat, what they're really giving up is this mass-produced kind of bread. And what they're finding their digestion is coping with better is the fact that they're no longer eating this kind of mass-produced bread. And there's something I sort of like to call it the American food writer Michael Pollan. He's a very interesting guy, and he basically comes up with a very simple rule for eating well, which is it's basically to the effect of eat proper food, mainly plants, not too much. Right, so it's very, very simple, and in a way, I think there's a kind of call it a paradox. It's nice to call things paradoxes. It makes them sort of more memorable. There's the Pollan paradox is that the more we find that nutrition is a very, very complex matter, and you can't break it down very easily and just say you need to get this, that, and the other. The more complex the nutrition becomes, actually, the simpler the eating rules become, because what they teach us is that you cannot micromanage your diet by measuring how much of this or that nutrient you're getting. The best way to eat well is actually just to eat proper food in a decent balance, and you'll find that will take care of things. I'm saying that not as a nutritionist, but this seems to me a reasonable conclusion to infer from the specialist evidence.
I think most nutritionists would get right behind you.
Yeah.
But I think as well what you were saying with the bread, for example, that's a perfect illustration of how actually a taste-driven food choice can lead you to something which is not only tastier, better for you, but is better as well for the distribution system that surrounds the bread, and the massive monocultures of wheat which are in Ukraine and Canada, and that actually by going with a taste-driven bread choice, you're going to choose a bread which is better for everything. It's not only for your stomach and your gut.
Yeah, but I'd say the complication there, as you're saying, is there is an element of education and culture in the taste thing. So if, as it were, you just sort of let someone unleash to follow their taste, and they haven't been given the right educational upbringing, then actually they're not going to make the right choices. They're going to potentially sort of binge on.
No, this is why you need as much
exposure
exposure as early as possible in life.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. So I'm now going to open up for questions. If you all stay there, because I want our speakers to be able to speak for themselves, along with Julian. So you want to come and join Naomi, just here. So any questions? Yes, please.
My name is Ben Williamson. I'm from People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Peter. I did like lots of it at the beginning chapters. That's a big problem, obviously, with chapter 5, kill with care. I just wonder, you've all spoken about animal welfare and reducing suffering and reducing pain to a certain extent. Surely the logical conclusion of that is not using animals for food at all. I don't know how in chapter 5 you draw the line at suffering as opposed to pain. You highlight Bentham, and I wonder how you think Bentham, how fine and careful Bentham was with this distinction between suffering and pain there. And also how you ignore other moral theorists like Singer and Schweitzer and Thoreau who have dappled with this problem for a long time. Why draw the line at suffering when ethical veganism seems to be to solve all the problems with regards to animal welfare and pain?
Well, I'm not sure it does, because you've got to ask various different questions here. First of all, you have to ask, how terrible is it that creatures suffer a certain amount of pain? And I think that one has to accept the fact that a certain amount of that is an inevitable part of animal life. This is where you have to have the non-romantic view. Animals in nature often do suffer. They don't just live.
It's not a choice between nature and farming. It's a choice between non-existence of farmed animals and farmed animals.
Oh well, non-existence. But then, why would you think it would be a bad thing? Or what's worse to have? Or what's better? Let's say in comparison. If you have a well-farmed animal, and most farmed look, I would agree about. Facts on the ground are that most farmed animals do not have good lives. We shouldn't be breeding them, and it's as simple as that. And in order to have a system of farming which is remotely humane, it would require less animals being farmed. I'm sure we'd agree with that. But I suppose the question the problem I have is, if you have a genuinely well looked after and brought up, say, cow on a good farm, why is that in any way a bad thing, given that you've got an animal life which wouldn't otherwise have existed? But there's a certain capacity for space. That space would have been filled by something. If you just leave fields to grow with plants and vegetables, animals will come in and live around that as well. You've got an animal life which is actually being very well looked after, which, if it does get ill, is going to be treated by a vet, and is going to then be killed at the end of its life prematurely from the point of view of natural lifespan, perhaps humanely and cleanly. Why would one think that's a terrible thing when what the end result is an animal life which is actually, in the lottery of life, it seems like one of the winners, because it amongst its wild cousins, so you see the wildlife documentaries, don't you? You see some animals being taken away in the beaks of predatory birds, and they don't die for hours and hours, or animals go lame in the wild, and they're lying there for days and days and days, dying and dying. So I can't see why one would think that it would be worse to have those kind of animals. I can't see it.
Please.
Hi, I'm Tom. I kind of want to probe that, but with two different questions. So maybe you'll give different answers. One, a point you made earlier, which was that you said farmers often have a close relationship with their animals. But I wonder, actually, is that really the case if in a lot of intensive farming nowadays, particularly pig and poultry, are not going to get to know 20,000 chickens and find their names, especially if they live for 30 days. So maybe, I don't know what you think about that. And then separately, I wonder, and this maybe follows the previous question, is do you think our food ethics have kept up with our ethics in society as a whole? Have they kept pace with it? Because maybe our ethics as society as a whole might be more in line with what the previous question was, but our ethics as food, we somehow think differently.
Yeah, two good questions. Obviously, what you're saying about intensive agriculture is entirely true. And what's interesting, though, is what leads people to these places. I think it was the Food Inc. documentary. I don't know if anyone's seen that. They had a very horrible example of a poultry farmer. And, you've got someone there who they never wanted that. It's not why they got it into the first place. by increments, the pressures from the suppliers led them to more and more intensive ways of farming. And they end up with these horrible sheds where the chickens are crammed in and having terrible lives. And people do get into that. In that case, you've got the farmer who they feel terrible. They didn't want to do it, and they're faced at that point of choice between their livelihood and their ethics, and they go for their livelihood, which is, it's not morally praiseworthy, but it's understandable. So of course it's not inevitable, and some people will. I'm sure there are people who just simply have created a facility or taken one on because they see the money in it and they don't care. So what I'm talking about, the relationship between the farmer and the animals, that's the optimal thing, which happens when you have a good farm that's well run, which you need the food system around it to make it possible, I think. Maybe Naomi could say something in a minute perhaps about the relationship the stalkers have with the animals, how they feel about it, because there is wild food as well is an important part of this, I think. The other thing is the question about whether food ethics has kept up with our other ethics. I think clearly no. I find it actually very surprising, actually, how many people, despite the fact we hear a lot about, say, Fairtrade and battery farming, how few people really take care about these things. So you go to a restaurant, for example, and if I go to a restaurant, I want to know something about where its meat's coming from, or I won't order meat there. I'll have a vegetarian dish or some wild fish, which I've got some idea of. But I find that's I am seem to be a bit strange. I go with people who are otherwise quite similar to me in their socio-economic backgrounds and education, and they'll just go in somewhere which is a high street chain or something after an event like this, and they say, "Oh, I'll have a steak." And I'm thinking, I'm surprised people aren't doing that, because as you say, there's so much around it. But I think, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things on people's minds and a lot of things people worry about. And I think, it takes a real effort, because it's very easy just to think, well, it's not that important really, is it? And I know when I'm in a supermarket, I'm going to buy the organic or the free range or something, and I'm on holiday. Ethics is something that you can take a holiday from when the consequences are not something you have to confront. But I don't know
I have a PhD student who's working at the moment looking at issues of what you just said, that when you go to a supermarket, you'll go and say, "Oh yeah, I'll get the organic," and then you go out to dinner, it's just like, yeah, whatever, with no thought about it at all. But to come back to the other points, I'm kind of with you on the. I don't see why we can't sort of move towards a system of, no real farm so much, and more wild, because it works. If in terms of environmentalism, as you were saying, the cows are getting a bad deal at the moment. Everybody's saying, too much methane, and all of the reasons that you said about the closed system, good thing, but as soon as you sort of break that virtuous cycle of return, and the cows are somewhere, and the effluent goes somewhere else, it's a bit of a disaster. But the wild requires more woodland. It requires all of those things that are, I suppose, sort of environmentally good. And what you said about you can't possibly know all of these animals as individuals, I again completely kind of agree with. We have animals at home, and we do know them all as individuals, and it's part of the thing behind the chicken project, And then say my partner eats a lot of meat. He loves meat, but he is the person who has to, if we have cockerels, when we've got millions of cockerels, he will, eventually eat one of those, and it's a very different kind of thing, but it matters. When Gunter got eaten, we were really eating Gunter, the cockerel, and that kind of made a difference. It wasn't just a sort of a random chicken from a supermarket. He was eating somebody that he knew and was more valued in life than in death, actually. But it also was a much more sort of important experience, and reduces the amount of meat that he wants to eat, because it feels filling when you eat Gunter rather than a chicken. Look,
I don't know, I'll come back a bit, because the wild farm thing, I don't think that's necessarily the key distinction, actually, because if you're talking about the environmental sustainability and everything as well, you can farm animals very efficiently sometimes, by, for example, there's land which isn't suitable for arable production, but it's good for grazing. That's a good use of land. But, you need to farm those animals. You need someone looking after them in order to do it. And that's something which hasn't got the real horrible aspects of industrial farming, but it's perfectly reasonable. And also, chickens in the garden, eating scraps, pigs. I mean, pigs should be eating leftovers, that's really, really efficient. I mean, these seem to be things which are very sustainable, not necessarily huge industrial scale. They're not. It's not about wild though. There's farming too, and even with wild things. I mean, I think as your slides perhaps suggest. I mean, there's a lot of husbandry goes into maintaining the environment.
I mean, that is true. I've just written a paper with a deer manager who, European deer management, and actually in many cases, if you go to Austria, all of the wild deer are fed. And it's kind of like it's domestication anew, actually.
I think there's something as well, like it's one thing discussing this here, we're sitting in like Tesco Nation, and it's so hard to buy any food that's not been through like some international conglomerate, and then the kind of travelling I'm doing where we're really going into really obscure little corners of places where there's certainly no distribution truck going there, and you don't see any more people as people that are like so much agents of what they eat. It's like the people are very much part of the ecosystem rather than it being people managing an ecosystem. Is the people aren't on top of it, they're integrated with it. And
that comes back to what I was saying about that sort of nature-culture divide. At the moment we are in a world where nature and culture are separate.
Well, we are here.
Here, absolutely, but
lots
elsewhere,
of the world
I completely agree. Deep time, it's different, and go to other places around the world, it's different. It's the Western situation where it is, human dominion over nature.
But I think you should be a bit more optimistic. You say it's difficult to find stuff here which hasn't been through international conglomerate. Not necessarily. It depends where you live. In places, I'm sure there are places in London. I live in Bristol. I get loads of stuff which is from the farm straight down the road. It's come straight from there to the independent shop.
I can find it. You can find it.
But I know most people don't. I agree.
I agree. Yes. Like most meals.
Yeah.
It's hard to source stuff properly.
Okay. More questions, Ophelia.
So I was wondering whether there was not a bit of tension maybe between the three of you, but Julian seemed to believe really on the sort of approach where the individual have the food choices to make, and it's really in their hands. And what Naomi, you were suggesting with these programs and letting people eat enough, but regulating and making sure that they don't eat too many, and what you were suggesting also about people being hypocrites, so it should be in the hands of people putting the right education programs and so on. So it's a very government, political-led approach. So I'm wondering where you think the right sort of place for choices is. Is it in the hand of governments and so on, and not trust people with choices, or should we really trust people?
Well, the short answer is it's mixed. I think I think it's absurd to think that we should just leave it completely to individual choices and not have any sort of regulation. I think there are things where government regulation and stuff is very important, and a lot of the systems are poor and wrong. A lot of the systems around agricultural subsidies and import tariffs are hugely destructive. But I think it doesn't let the individual off the hook of their own decisions and their own responsibility. So I certainly don't think it's an either or. I wouldn't like to rely entirely on either of those two things. I think as individuals we can only make our own individual choices, and so we kind of have to take responsibility for that, our own thinking. But in terms of the deeper problems, sure. I mean, there has to be structural and systemic stuff which is out of my control as an individual, I think.
Can you give an example of something that shouldn't be left to individuals?
That shouldn't be left to individuals. I think minimum welfare standards for poultry. I think they've increased standards. Probably not good enough yet, but you can't get caged eggs and no longer legal in Europe, and they shouldn't be. And I don't think it should be left to individuals to do that, because apart from anything, it goes back to that thing that if we think this is morally important, we also have to recognise the fact that you can't blame people who are short of cash for taking the cheaper option, and in a sense that should be taken out of their hands for I think. So there are all sorts of things about welfare, for example, anything and things around pollutants as well and things like that.
Okay, I've got 2 questions. 1, 2.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So one of the things that has only been brushed on, mostly by them, is the different approaches to agriculture, to food production, etc., and their relationship to people's livelihoods. And it seems like a lot of the things that the questions have been focusing on ignore perhaps the largest influence on food choice and on livelihood, which is the economics of poverty. And of course that has political inputs, etc. But it seems like a lot of the conversations that we're having, it's all well and good to have them in the abstract, but some of them really don't mean very much unless you somehow take them to an applicable point. So the question of, can we eat no meat, period. For some people, there isn't even a question of eating meat, there's not even a question of having a food choice. It's more a question of, do I manage to send my kid to school, or do I manage to eat 2 meals a day instead of 1? So the global systems that we're talking about, the global systems that we aren't talking about, have such a profound impact on the production systems that I'd really be interested to know what your sort of approach to those are. What about the wild food aspect when there are large portions of the area where there is no such thing effectively as a easily accessible or sufficiency of wild foods of any kind, let alone what you grow in your garden that's barely palatable if you've boiled it for 2 years.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think it's this huge issue you've raised, and so I think it's very difficult to say anything remotely like a comprehensive answer. But I think if I can take some of the general thrust of it, which I hope this is what you were trying to get at. Apologies if I misunderstand. I think you are right that it is very easy for any discussions about how we ought to eat to become too divorced from the realities and the pragmatics, and pragmatics becomes a dirty word. And I think that's one reason why when people get too precious about the virtues of like organics and anti-GM, etc., that the risk is that they end up endorsing things which, although on the whole might be good for people, are not entirely. And I think we always need to be open-minded as to, okay, but what is the specific solution needed in this particular case, which is going to be most beneficial for people at the hard end. And one of the most interesting examples there, I think, is this Golden Rice project, which is a GM project, which is nothing to do with Monsanto, right? It's a non-profit thing in which they're aiming to sort of genetically modified rice with high levels of vitamin B12 or so, which is meant to help people. Now, I don't have a settled view that is a good thing necessarily, but I think that such is the kind of hostility to GM, often based on objections to the kind of form of GM which is in corporate control and has very nasty side effects, makes people kind of like think, not even going to look at that. But there might be very specific GM crops which may be of benefit to the people who are the hungriest and most malnourished in the world. And at the very least, it would be wrong to sort of like dismiss those things out of hand without thinking about them, because we've got into a kind of idealised idea about the way the agricultural system could be, and we're not confronting the fact that actually we've got a massively growing population with all sorts of issues. So, yeah. Go on.
Ben,
Go on.
You're itching. You're itching.
Got
to
me
say something.
sweaty hands.
Yeah.
The golden rice thing is to put vitamin E, unless I'm much mistaken, into the rice, because it's people are getting blind, especially in India, due to deficiencies. The thing is, when the Green Revolution came in, especially in Punjab, 90% of all rice biodiversity was lost from India. A lot of these original rice varieties were grown symbiotically with lots of other wild plants that grew along next to them, which provided loads and loads of minerals for people. So the fact of the matter is that when people went in there with their high yielding varieties, which should have been rebranded highly responsive varieties because they're only responsive to massive amounts of pesticides, fertilizers and other petrochemicals, then they did away with all the sources of minerals that they had. So it's one of these tech fixes coming in, completely obliterating biodiversity and leaving people hungry as a result. When I'm like avidly anti-golden rice, it's nothing to do with being anti-GM. It's to do with the people who like have caused this system. And actually, if traditional agriculture had been left in place, people wouldn't be going blind. It's just it's that simple.
Well, a couple of things to say there. First of all, there's the argument that it may be true that a huge wrong turn was taken 30, 40 years ago, but that given where we have to start where we are now, and it may be that there are in the long run you want to try and sort of recreate this better system of agriculture, and I'd agree with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't some things that you can't change the system overnight. There might be some interventions which have a short-term thing. The second thing, which is again, I don't know whether anyone is fully qualified to answer this question here, but the Green Revolution, which as you say was actually introduced lots of things which were for long-term problems with agriculture. So the Green Revolution is a bit of a strange term, that people are familiar with it, because we think of green now as being environmental or something. It's actually ways of massively increasing yields particularly in developing countries in agriculture, often relying on chemical inputs and everything. But a lot of people do credit that with actually ending a lot of hunger in the world. Now, even if it has created long-term problems and issues. And so I wouldn't be, I suppose at least want to question whether or not you're right, that everything would have been all right and people would have been well nourished had we not done these things. There's an alternative possibility, at least to me, which seems to be that it succeeded in feeding many more people, but it introduced other problems which in the long run are really difficult and are problematic, which makes it then quite complicated to know what to do exactly about it now we're here.
I mean, the basic opinion, it seems to me, is that healthy populations are really, really tied to ideas of biodiversity. The disasters of biodiversity that the Green Revolution caused, especially in India, and it's now happening again in Africa, is really a massive thing. But I'm going to go back to your question, if that's all right, because I think what you were talking about with access to food and things like this, I think it's mostly comes down to aspects of like habitat preservation and access to habitats. So with things like land grabbing or even less aggressive forms of land ownership, a lot of people who would have had lives which took them to different areas to get different resources during different periods, droughts or other periods of the year, then they would have had access to these areas, and so they all would have had like a source of food which now they don't have access to, and so to me it's much more to do with like preserving the ecosystems that wild foods and things can be collected from, but also preserving people's access to those resources. And I don't think it's so much to do with raising populations, actually. I think it's much more to do with obsessive land ownership and stopping people having access to things rather than an actual lack.
As well as the other point of access as well.
Okay. Let's take, you've been waiting a while.
So many things got brought up during that. So I'm a food science student at the University of Leeds, a master's student, and one of my first lectures in a food processing class, the lecturer told me food is not seasonal, which was very frustrating as I've cooked professionally, and I don't know, just a lot of really frustrating issues that go with it. So how do you think like chefs, cooks, food thinkers, anybody that's within like the food industry can kind of change this ethos that is now pervading what we eat every day. I mean, I did a whole lab on the chlorine wood method, and I can tell you panadin, which is what is added to it, which is what makes that bread work, tastes really bad. So, I mean, what's the point in doing it? But so the whole thing is, how can people honestly think that food is not seasonal? Or, like, I don't know. What is the ethos there in terms of how we live today, in terms of the canned environment that we have today?
Well, I mean, the seasonalities, I've got a chapter on the seasonality, yeah, so I don't want to sort of like try and summarise it, but I think it is an interesting one to try and dig into and ask what exactly does it mean for a start, and what's so good about it. Because it's not like it's obvious what it actually means for something to be seasonal, because it depends partly again on your catchment area. You had that very interesting map. You were talking about the Nordic region, and quite rightly pointing out that, you know, there are places in sort of the southern Italy which are closer to Copenhagen than other parts of the Nordic region. So from a sort of a cultural point of view, you've got things which are in season in the Nordic region, but that doesn't mean they're closer. Some people would think, well, that's the point, isn't it? So, you know, I mean, so there's all sorts of issues around that, about what's seasonal. And also the other thing is that, again, I don't think we should be too romantic in the sense that I think that for as long as we've been farming, we've been trying to extend seasons. I mean, of course we do. Yeah, we don't. No one wants only to be able to harvest things in a very small window. And, you know, things like greenhouses and things are ways of extending seasons, and people have been doing that for years. So I don't think that seasonality is, it's dangerous. It becomes one of those, again, those sort of like fetishes we have and everything, and sort of like elevate it to a master virtue. And bananas, for example, I mean, bananas aren't seasonal. They come from the Caribbean, but great, why not eat them all round? Because they're the kind of things which can be shipped, and shipping is a very low carbon way of transporting food. So in terms of environment impact, it's very, very low. No reason why we shouldn't do that. So I think we have to sort of ask you, well, what is it we're really looking for when we're looking for seasonality? And a lot of the time, I think it's partly to do with certain things are just better at certain times of the year. So from a chef's point of view, from an Noma kitchen point of view, you want to cook things when they're absolutely their best. When they haven't travelled so far, they've often lost less taste as well, so that's a good thing as well. And sometimes in order to get things growing out of season, you have to do things in terms of, you know, chemical inputs and heated grow houses, which is environmentally very bad. But not always. So I think you have to sort of, you have to kind of break it down, I think, you know, what is it we're looking for which is good? And that means that a lot of things we do eat more according to the seasons and so forth. But it's not a kind of I think it's a kind of a term which covers a number of things which by themselves are virtues. It's hard to identify it as a virtue in itself, other than the fact that I think that there is a certain aesthetic thing about being aware of and in tune to the turning of the seasons. And I think that's something to really value. I think that's perhaps the only thing about seasonality which is inherently a good thing about it. The other things are associated with lots of very good things are important about rearing food in a sustainable, tasty way.
What did your lecturer mean?
He was arguing the point that, you know, we have to, as food scientists, make people believe that natural food, and that is essentially not the way to go, because we want to sell canned foods. We want to be able to sell food that's processed. We want to be able to sell the things that I'm studying. And that was his point. And it's like, well, no, you're wrong. A peach out of a can isn't going to be the same thing as a ripe peach in the middle of the summer. Like,
surely preservation is a good thing, though.
Preservation is fine.
So when something is in season and you preserve it so you can eat it when there is nothing.
But there's also, we've lost so many preservation systems in terms, I mean, I know the Nordic Food Lab has worked very much with fermentation, where that whole preservation system has been lost in our culture. And we are also having nutritional effects because of it. So how do you deal with that kind of sterilization of food because of the way that we process it now.
I suppose you're asking for, I mean, if we take the belief, which in archaeology we believe that sort of food represents culture, so if we understand food, we can understand that particular culture. So what you're saying is that there has been a pretty big culture change, so therefore we need a culture change. My talk demonstrates that this happens. That's one sort of comfort that we can take from the archaeological record, is that culture does change. It has changed and it will continue to do so. It's just about making sure that it changes in the way that at the time you think is the correct way for it to go.
Last word, Julian, and then I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up and we'll move to a reception where you can go on talking to speakers. So anything you want to say in conclusion? Apart from, let me tell you, books are at the back. If you haven't got a copy of Julian's book, they're available at discount price tonight, and I'm sure Julian would sign it for you. Anything you want to say?
Well, perhaps as a concluding thought, one of the virtues I sort of talk about in the book is of gratitude. So I should first of all express my gratitude to Ben and Naomi and for taking part in this and really making it much more interesting than it would be if it was just me rabbiting on. But also to Barry and Ophelia and Shara at the Institute for hosting this event. But when I talked about gratitude, and I was thinking about sort of rituals of gratitude in religion and what's kind of lost. I'm not a religious person, and therefore I don't have these rituals of grace and so forth, and I think there's a loss there, because actually I think that one of the things that and I think in terms of like enjoyment of food and appreciation of food, that's perhaps one of the most fundamental things, is to cultivate a habit of gratitude, because it's that kind of thing keeps us in mind that when we're enjoying good food, it's not just about this is lovely and this is great for me and look how pure I am because I'm only putting good things into the temple of my body, and whereas the unwashed masses are eating sort of Pizza Hut and everything. If we're going to be concerned about, I think having an attitude of gratitude towards food as a habit is a good way of keeping in mind a lot of things which are very important about it, about thinking about where it's come from, what has been required for it to come to us, the loss of animal life in some cases, and also from pleasure as well, because a lot of the time we eat too mindlessly, we eat too quickly, pausing to think. So I think that no matter what you might think about my stance on some of the big food morality issues around things, I think that perhaps everyone would agree that we have a lot to be grateful for with our food, and then nurturing the attitude of gratitude to it is a good way of focusing the mind on what's important about food, and not simply just getting carried away either taking it for granted or turning it into a kind of just a narcissistic kind of purely hedonistic thing. Not that a certain amount of hedonism is not in order.
So we're going to combine a little bit of hedonism with a little bit of ritual when we move to the back and have something to drink and to share with you. But let's express our gratitude to Ben, Naomi, and especially to Julian for the book. Thank you.